Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the SILP podcast. I'm Akshat Goyal, joined with me my co-host Rudra Athray, and today we shall be speaking to Miss Sue Willman KC. Rudra, could you kindly introduce our guest for today?
Thank you, Akshat. Ms. Willman is a prominent human rights lawyer whose work has had a profound impact on both national and international landscapes. Her career is a testament to the power of law to challenge injustice and protect the vulnerable. For over 30 years, she has been at the forefront of groundbreaking public interest litigation, tackling complex issues ranging from migrant rights and environmental protection to corporate accountability and international human rights violations. She is a sought-after expert on issues like universal jurisdiction, using UK law to hold perpetrators of torture accountable, and has worked tirelessly to support human rights defenders in conflict zones. Her collaboration with NGOs like War on Want, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch underscores her commitment to working collaboratively to achieve meaningful change. From challenging arms exports to Saudi Arabia to advocating for the rights of indigenous communities in Colombia, her work spans the globe. Adding to her impact, Ms. Willman has also been instrumental in establishing the leading Human Rights and Environment Clinic at King's College London, where she mentors and trains the next generation of legal advocates, equipping them with the skills and knowledge to tackle pressing global issues. In addition to being described as an uncompromising, fearless, and tactically astute lawyer, Ms. Willman is a strategist, an innovator, and a passionate advocate for a more just world. Ms. Willman has been awarded the honorary King's Counsel. This is in recognition of her work in founding the Asylum Support Appeals Project, ASAP, which provided free representation to destitute asylum seekers. Additionally, she's also been recognized for publishing articles, authoring a series of textbooks on asylum support, and advising a parliamentary committee on an inquiry to drive legislative reforms. Ms. Willman, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. We welcome you and look forward to the episode. So, Ms. Willman, we'd like to start off this episode by asking you what motivated you to pursue a career in public and human rights law.
So I come from a backwater, a tiny village in rural England, and when I was 18 I went to study law at Oxford University. It started with Roman law, went through trusts and property, and the most exciting thing that I got to study was family law and labour law, not a hint of international human rights law. But I was interested in justice and equality, and I was inspired by the women's and the anti-racist movement. So I managed to work in the non-profit sector and carry on that work after I left university.
Wonderful. And I think it's really interesting to see how, when you were studying, human rights law was probably not a huge focus when you look at the legal pedagogy. And when you compare it to today's day, when we have courses dedicated to human rights law, what do you think is a more educational change that has taken place? And what are your opinions on the same?
So one thing this triggers is when you're leaving law school, don't think I'm going to be a human rights lawyer straight away or I'm going to be an international lawyer straight away. I got into human rights law by doing housing and property law, and it's much easier if you start off with some specialism in another area. Most areas of law throw up some kind of human rights, like criminal law, for example, obviously has lots of justice and human rights issues. You've also made me to think about environmental law, which completely didn't exist really as a subject to study 20, 30 years ago, and even now it's quite an emerging area of law. There aren't a lot of environmental law practitioners in India, and that's why I think it presents quite a great opportunity to students. But again, they might not access it directly by going to work at an environmental law firm. They might access it indirectly through other routes. So, for example, you may go off to work for a corporate law firm and develop a specialism on sustainability or net zero or transition or ESG, and if you're known to know about that subject or write about it or have an interest in it, when an opportunity comes up, then maybe you can jump in there and get involved in practicing more environmental related law.
Right. You mentioned about how, when you're starting off, these laws were still developing, such as environmental law just coming in, right? Considering that you practiced regularly with laws such as these, could you maybe tell us a little bit about, say, a particularly challenging case that came your way, where, your qualities, as you've been described earlier, as someone who's uncompromising, fearless, and tactically astute? Could you tell us about any case that challenged these values, dealing with a new law, so to speak, and how is that to work with in practice?
So I hope this answers your question, but it also relates to this idea about starting in one area of law and moving across. So I was involved in representing a man who had been tortured in Sudan. He was a Muslim extremist, and he'd gone to visit Sudan to meet somebody, and he was thrown into jail and tortured, and the British government went to visit him, and they didn't intervene, although it was obvious that he'd been tortured. So we were involved in a claim to get compensation for him of about 300 lakh compensation. And having been involved in that case and publicising it then led to me getting involved over many years with working with Arab activists from the Gulf. So during the Arab Spring, a lot of people who were seeking democratic reforms were rounded up. And then in 2012, some of those royalty government members were visiting London for the London Olympics. So I started working with Bahraini activists, and they knew that the Prince of Bahrain was going to be walking through the London Olympics carrying a flag of Bahrain, although he'd been implicated in the torture of and had been on TV in Bahrain kind of supporting the torture and mistreatment of athletes and opposition members. So the way that we approach international human rights law to try and highlight those kind of issues is we just look for any kind of legal action that will then attract publicity and draw attention to that issue. So we would have a discussion with the activists about a legal strategy, develop a legal strategy, and they decided to try and do a demonstration outside the Olympics to draw attention to this, which they then would expect to be banned. So then we would be bringing a legal case about threatening judicial review, which I suppose is our equivalent of appeal, against the police for banning demonstrations outside the Olympics. And then that led to bringing a series of cases involving opposition activists who were in exile in the UK. They were deprived of their citizenship, but they used the law to highlight the situation of Bahrain, which is quite a tiny country, not much heard of, and make sure that it was before the eyes of politicians and in the national media. And in particular, they wanted to bring a case against Prince Nasser of Bahrain, who was visiting the UK, to try to use universal jurisdiction to have him investigated for torture. And so we started this case, asked the police to investigate him under universal jurisdiction, and they refused to investigate, saying that he had immunity, saying that he had state immunity. So this is quite a long answer to your question. I won't go too much more into the case at this point, but just to say that working on those kind of cases, you may be subject to surveillance. We would get threats of libel from firms like Shillings, who deal with defamation cases against our clients. So you have to have a complicated legal strategy to deal with all those kind of issues and make sure that you do a lot of risk assessment with the clients. There's a high degree of confidentiality about any documents that you're storing, that kind of thing.
Wonderful. So I think something that really stood out to me, I think the two things that really stood out to me in your answer. Firstly, how when you're looking at this area of law, a lot of legal strategy also entails with starting discourse in society at large through demonstrations and the like. And at the same time, as a lawyer in this field, there's so many other things you have to take into consideration, such as potential threats that may be leveled against you. So just in the same vein, I had a question for you. You worked on the Saudi arms export issue. If you could maybe give us a little more information on how your experience was with dealing and working on this issue, especially concerning the recent developments that have happened on a global stage when you look at arms export. In addition to how you as a lawyer or a lawyer in your field has to mold their legal strategy with the greater goal of achieving human rights, of achieving a cleaner environment and the like.
So one of the difficult issues for doing this kind of law is financing it. And one way that law students can get involved through legal clinics or through NGOs, and in fact pro bono teams in large law firms sometimes get involved in this way, is through interventions amicus curiae. So I was involved in a case brought by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade against the UK government to try to stop them from exporting arms to Saudi Arabia, which were being used in Yemen for blanket bombing, which the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, CAT, said was a breach of international humanitarian law, and so the UK were breaching the law. But the way that I became involved was through an intervention, an amicus, so I was representing Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I suppose it's an example of a case which takes a very long time. So it went through the High Court and then through our Court of Appeal, because we have an interim phase before we get to the Supreme Court. But during that period, the war had been waging for a couple of years, so you could say, well, what was the point? We ended up winning the case on a very narrow issue, but in the meantime, the war had continued. However, for the NGOs, it's a way of shining a light on that issue. And currently, I'm involved in another similar intervention in relation to the UK exporting arms to Israel for use in Palestine. That case is brought by a Palestinian NGO called Al-Haq, but again, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have intervened by drafting a long kind of expert report submission which talks about what's happening in Gaza and talks about international humanitarian law. And again, that case has not concluded despite being issued maybe nearly 18 months ago, and it still hasn't got to the first final hearing. But in the meantime, some of the pressure exerted by that case and political pressure and a change of government has meant that the UK has agreed to cut. Initially it suspended arms exports, now it's cut them down, so it's just exporting one kind of F-35 fighter plane parts, which we're still fighting about. But obviously we've now got the ceasefire situation. So I suppose it shows that the result that you want, which is your final day in court and a wonderful judgment, you may not get, but there are lots of other benefits of bringing litigation which you can achieve, as well as lots of risks.
Mm-hmm. So something that stood out to me was the fact that working with such NGOs and organizations as Amnesty International, it's something that you've done continuously throughout your career. And like you mentioned, the landscape is continuously changing, right? These are situations that are evolving and developing, and these cases might take months on end, if not years, to conclude. We would be really interested to know how exactly does your, say, partnership or work with such NGOs work over such a long period of time, and also if you have any advice for, say, young students who want to get in this field to build such connections with such NGOs and to collaborate and work on them on such matters.
So my first advice to law students and young lawyers is to try to find a niche, a specialism, so something that you're interested in, that maybe you write blogs about, that you write law journal articles about, that you know about, and look for organisations or individuals that are working in that field, and go to events where they might have speakers. Get there early, try to speak to the speaker, try to be the person who's very well researched and knows the senior advocate's most recent case, so that you can speak to them afterwards, or be the first person to ask the question. And don't be afraid to approach people who are involved in such organisations, or might be connected to an organisation that's connected to that organisation. So you might get rejected 9 out of 10 times, but a good example for me is an American friend of mine. She was a teacher and she decided that she wanted to get into being a chef, and she approached a celebrity chef, via social media, and then ended up with a day learning knife skills in his kitchen. So I think if you're creative, then you need to network, make connections, build up your skills, and so then when you do get the opportunity, you have got enough knowledge to impress the person that you're meeting, but also say yes to things. I know we need to keep a work-life balance and stay sane when we're working 20 hours a day at a corporate law firm, but sometimes it's just that dinner invite that you go to where you meet somebody and you talk to them, and an opportunity comes out of it, a connection. So that's my tip.
Wonderful. So I think it's not only balancing your networking skills, but also doing your homework on the people and the person you're going to meet.
Yeah.
Just in addition to what Akshat asked, another very important aspect of the work you've done is crowdfunding. How you mobilize these movements against, I would say, injustice through crowdsourcing and crowdfunding. So how do you go about that as a lawyer, and how would a younger lawyer trying to get into the field of humanitarian law go about crowdfunding?
So the way that cases are funded in India is a bit different from the UK. You don't have the conditional fee agreement arrangement. So in the UK, I can charge a client a lesser amount of money, and then if I win the case, then I will recover costs paid by the court if the case is successful. But crowdfunding has really taken off, I suppose, in the last 15, 20 years. An American woman came to the UK and set up a platform called Crowd Justice, which is worth having a look at. And I was lucky to have the first case on that platform. It was for a Colombian trade unionist who'd been kidnapped and tortured by paramilitaries. And we brought a case against the oil company BP, because they had been financing the Colombian army, and we were trying to argue that they were complicit in that. And so we raised about 20 lakh, which isn't a huge amount of money, but it was enough for the kind of early investigation of the case. And now that platform crowdfunds cases ranging from the junior doctors who sued the government, and they raised a few crore through the crowdfunding platform, to somebody who's having let's say a mine or a development built in their area and they don't want it, to smaller cases. And the way it works is people use their campaign network or their social contacts, or the fact that the public really care about, say, air pollution in Calcutta and they want to improve it, to put in a small amount of money or a larger amount of money, and the amount builds up, and the lawyers sort of use it also as a campaigning platform. So they might try and get the money for the investigation, a certain amount of money, and then they'll report on that and say what's happened, and then there's a stage when they issue the court proceedings and what happens in the preliminary hearing. So the public feel invested in the case as it's going along. So it's not just about the money, it's also about building a campaign. And it seems that at the moment you don't have anything to ban you from crowdfunding in India, so it may be worth trialling for cases that can capture the public imagination, or where someone's got a big network or constituency. But also I've met young lawyers or recent graduates who've managed to set up their own NGOs or social enterprises and raise money from foundations and charitable funding. So that's another way of funding these kind of cases, to partner with some kind of charitable organisation or trust that can fund some of the work.
Absolutely.
So you talked about how crowdfunding basically comes down to public accountability, right? It's the public who's funding your work to take action, right? Something that similarly exists in India, not in terms of financing, but in terms of public accountability, would come in through the public interest litigation that's native to India, so to speak. However, even you might have a list of the MC Mehta judgments that give us some sort of environmental jurisprudence in India, but the PIL system is not without its criticism, right? Considering how it's been evolving over the past few decades, do you think this is something that's been a boon for India with regards to important matters coming up in interest of the public at large? And do you think there are still challenges to the system that needs to be reworked and looked at through the judiciary or the legislative?
So I first came to India in 1996, and I came across the PIL system then. And it was being used for a Dalit to bring a claim about, hundreds of Dalits in Ahmedabad. And I was really envious of your PIL system, because in the UK, we can't bring a case like that, a strategic case for 100 people or 20 people. You have to keep bringing individual cases. And a lot of my litigation has been for asylum seekers in poor conditions or immigration detention. So I want to achieve systemic change, but all I can manage to achieve is that person gets rehoused or released from detention, and then I've got to bring another case. At one stage, the government started denying access to any welfare support to all asylum seekers who had arrived in the UK and hadn't claimed asylum on arrival. And it ended up that hundreds, thousands of asylum seekers were street homeless, and we wanted to bring cases for all of them. In India, we could have just brought one PIL. But in the UK, the courts were clogged up with maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 similar cases, or with the lawyers claiming costs, which was a waste of public money. On the other hand, I can see that the poor old Supreme Court has got 78,000 plus cases pending. Our Supreme Court only hears about 50 cases a year. So I think there must be other mechanisms you could use, like you don't have an appeal system in between. Could cases be triaged at the beginning? And also, could you have a cost system so that if cases are vexatious or clearly vexatious, costs can be awarded against the person who's bringing the case to try and deter some vexatious cases? But just having that ability to bring those cases seems worth it, even if a percentage of the cases are vexatious or not so useful.
Yeah. Exactly. So I think at this stage, we've gone from one topic to another, but I do want to take a step back and really get your opinion on, your understanding of the intersection between human rights law and environmental law. You've done extensive work in these fields, and I just love to hear what you think and how both of these fields of law in the jurisprudence flow into one another and at the same time empower each other.
So let's go right back to India. I started to become involved with NUJS because of the Sundarbans. A British Indian barrister called Krishnendu Mukherjee wrote an article about climate migration.
Yes.
After he went to the Sundarbans, talking about how because of climate change, rising sea levels, islands being flooded, and it being harder to fish or farm, people would migrate to Calcutta or Dhaka and end up working in garment factories producing the kind of clothes we're probably wearing. And so we thought, well, let's go there, let's bring a big climate case, highlight to the global north that climate change is affecting people here where lots of people in London have never heard of. And we have started to work on an OECD complaint, which is a soft law complaint about British finance companies that have financed the Rampal coal power plant in Bangladesh, which is obviously causing emissions. But when we went to meet the communities in the Sundarbans, we found they didn't necessarily have a vocabulary about climate change. They might say the monsoon's coming earlier or later, there's less rain, there was a big cyclone. But the thing that affected them was, that they go into the forest, their husband is killed by a tiger because they're having to go deeper into the forest to get food, and then they can't claim compensation for it. So it's really difficult to separate climate change and harm to nature, the environmental law issues, the pure environmental law issues, from people's livelihoods and social justice and their day-to-day lives. And that's how we've ended up at NUJS with a proposed environmental law clinic that's called People's Rights and Nature Clinic, because we found that we have to work with the community on their social justice issues before we can move on to those, more kind of remote, high-powered environmental issues about global climate change.
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect segue for our next question as well, about the clinic you've set up at NUJS. So if you could maybe tell us, looking at the next 5 years, maybe the next 10 years, what are your goals for this clinic and what do you hope to achieve?
So in the last 3 or 4 years, first of all during COVID, by Zoom, I've been working with Ankita Chakravarti and your VC and Professor Chengappa to try to develop an environmental law clinic here. But I found it difficult because students have to be very focused on getting enough credits. You don't have much time to do voluntary work in between. And although clinical legal education is compulsory in India, it's not done in the US or UK type of approach where you have a lawyer like me based in the university supervising cases, and there aren't very many resources for it. So we're hoping that through a collaboration between King's and NUJS, we can persuade NUJS to find some resources to get a clinic going so that you can get expertise that will then be useful on your resume. But a couple of weeks ago I was at NLSIU and we organised a workshop with academics and lawyers like Ritwik Dutta and Sanjay Hegde, Supreme Court advocate, and NGOs from all around India to talk about developing environmental law clinics in India. And you've got some really interesting things happening, like you've got Avaz in Delhi. They're setting up schemes between law students where they're kind of incentivized to work on a project with a certificate or some finance coming through it at the end. There's a GAMI which is working more on an AI and AT issues in Bengaluru. So I suppose I'm interested in learning more about what law students think can work for them, so that they're incentivized to do this kind of work that they want to do, whether it's through a credit course, as we've been trying to do, or whether we can find some other kind of system. But I hope that I can carry on networking with law schools across India, especially NUJS, to make this happen.
Yeah, certainly. I think taking root with this particular clinic would be how, students institutionally get interested in such activities and take up such causes and look beyond just corporate law as a gateway after they're done graduating. Speaking about legal education and just law students generally, for the longest time, human rights law or environmental law has been sort of, by at least I've seen this done by my peers and my seniors, where it has always been shelved as something that an academician should worry about, right? Not something a practitioner really gets to interact a lot with. And you spoke a little bit about how you get involved with such, practical purposes, but could there be any recommendations that you would say, for example, the networking events you talked about, right? A lot of it could perhaps be inaccessible considering that you're studying in an Indian law college with not as much access to resources or even NGOs who do that kind of work. Could you recommend anything for Indian students to get involved in the practice of international law as a whole and humanitarian law as well through their school years as well?
Well, I think there's lots of opportunities on social media now. I mean, some of this work, there are occasional research opportunities that are remote, But you have got a lot of NGOs working locally, and I think if you, I think you need to be creative and brave. So you need to look at whatever area of law you might be working on. You could look at IP, for example, and you know there's environmental law issues that come up in intellectual property. For example, one of the academics at King's worked on indigenous rights to plants which were being taken by companies. So I think that any area of law you might be able to find some human rights aspect to it. And then you need to reach out to organisations and see if you can do some human rights or environmental type work there. So whatever your practice is, even if you're in a corporate law firm, there'll be a chance to do some pro bono work, for example. And in my law firm, I really wanted to do international law, but we didn't have much finance for it. So I made sure that I had a strong practice which generated income, and that I had, built my reputation within the law firm so that I could then negotiate to do that kind of work. But coming back to the law students, I think there are organisations in Calcutta, like there's Life, there's Disha. If students can support a law clinic here, that can give them opportunities. So I think it is going back to this point about do your homework, get on social media, and just use your time effectively to make opportunities. And if there aren't any, then think about those students like at Avaz who've set up their own NGO. So one of my students on the transnational environmental law course between King's and NUJS, who was at Jindal, set up his own law clinic at Jindal, and after graduating he's now setting up, he's gone to a law practice in MP, and he's trying to do a bit of environmental law work on the side. So I think if you're determined enough, it's possible.
Absolutely, that's actually an amazing answer. I think it's determination that takes you to places. Something that you said and something that really stood out to me was how you're expected to be brave as a lawyer trying to carve out their niche in the field of humanitarian law. And when you talk about bravery, you're also talking about oftentimes a lot of resistance that lawyers working in this field are exposed to, not only from corporates but oftentimes even governments. So as a humanitarian lawyer, how on a personal level do you find the motivation and the resistance to keep championing your cause?
So in the UK, the government has started, or the previous government had a campaign against activist lawyers. And the high point was during Brexit, when there was a picture of all the Supreme Court judges headed enemies of the people in one of the tabloid newspapers, because they had decided that the government couldn't decide to leave the EU without first taking it to Parliament. A friend of mine who's an immigration lawyer had someone come into their office reception with a knife, who was intending to attack him, instead attack the receptionist. And immigration lawyers are very targeted in the UK because of the controversy about migrants coming over the channel from France to the UK, which has become a hot political topic. And because I work with asylum seekers and refugees, sometimes I get some hate mail, but I'm really inspired by the activists that I work with. So I've mentioned Bahrain. My client from Bahrain was imprisoned, beaten by the police. He's got a scar across his forehead. He was ill-treated in prison, and he dedicates his whole life to fighting for democracy and human rights in Bahrain. So when his wife was giving birth in hospital, he was live tweeting from her bedside about the latest human rights issue. And people like that really inspire me. So here in Calcutta, you have Ritwik Dutta, who's got an environmental NGO, Life, and he has had his tax affairs investigated and has been criminalised in relation to that. So he's had to become a tax expert, but some of his clients have been shot at and even killed. So the people who are really on the front line are environmental defenders around the world who are living in rural areas. Us lawyers are generally in quite a privileged position. And it is those environmental defenders and human rights defenders taking the risks that really inspire me and think it's important to carry on doing this kind of work.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Maybe we could shift to the conversation regarding, academics and how,
Please.
Traditionally an LLM has been sort of a sine qua non, as in if you do not have an LLM pursuing, say, environmental law and international human rights is something that's almost impossible, right? Do you think that holds true even today, considering that the platform is changing? There is a lot of involvement, and as you mentioned, there are so many opportunities that are available through social media and through NGOs near you, right? Do you think it's enough for an individual to have just an undergraduate degree and still, find a career for themselves, a niche for themselves in this space?
So being a lawyer, I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer. But first of all, it depends on the kind of degree you have. If you're at a national law university, you have already competed against thousands of people to get there. And if you have a good grade when you leave, then that's a pretty good start, and you've been here for 5 years. As a practicing lawyer, I'm more interested in the experience that people have and the interest that they have. And I know it's difficult, but any kind of internship or practical experience of working with other lawyers, or evidence that you can draft well because you've written, an excellent article on climate change law or whatever it is, will impress me as a practicing lawyer. But if you want to go and work at the UN or some kind of think tank, then a master's degree may be necessary. Or if you spent your time partying and ended up with not a very good grade, then you might need to make up for that. And so it may be more important to have an LLM.
Okay. So while LLM is one of the many ways you get that position, it's not the only way. And there are many other ways that one person can find their calling and their purpose in this field of law. It's very insightful. But I think on that note, it in fact brings us to the end of our podcast. So we have one last question for you, Ms. Willman, which is if there's one thing or one piece of advice that you'd like to give your younger self or all our young listeners who are looking forward to foray into this field of law, what would it be?
So one of the things you have to cope with is rejection. Some of the students here this week have been at an interview and haven't got a job. And some of my students on the clinical course haven't yet got work. I think you need to be confident. I once applied for a job at the best human rights law firm in London and I was rejected. I was pretty disappointed at the time, but I managed to spend the time I had working on writing a book. I found out that the partner I'd be working with was very tricky to work with, so I'd had a lucky escape. And then I went to work for a smaller firm where there were more opportunities and I became partner more quickly. And also, you don't need to be in a hurry. It took me quite a long time to get to where I wanted to be. So if you haven't got your dream job in the first few years after law school, I think it's not the end of the world. Just keep on experimenting and persisting and as I said earlier, be brave, and if you really want it, you'll get it in the end.
Right. I think that's a perfect note to end this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your wonderful insight in this particular field of law and just the body of experience you've had over the previous few years. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me to NUJS and welcoming me so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.